Welcome to Fantastic Fat Loss Physiology, Part 3. My name's Gavin Aquilina. For those of you that haven't attended Part 1 and Part 2, I'm the Chief Inspiration Coach at ptcoach.co. I'm a Global Master Trainer for Life Fitness Academy, and it's given me the chance to travel over the world over the last 16 years and present in many different places. I'm also the Education Director at Life Fitness Australia and a guest coach at the Australian Institute of Fitness. Just to kick off today, my email is gavin@gavinaquilina.com. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email them through and I'll answer those, and I'll look at posting them up on Facebook to let other people know some of the questions that are coming through. If you missed Part 1 and 2, a bit of a summary as to why Fantastic Fat Loss Physiology. Basically, I completed my Masters, and in my Masters, my goal was to try and identify the physiological factors that might limit an individual's ability to lose weight. And I wanted to identify factors that could be tested, measured, and a possible intervention put in place. Now, it's what we call a systems model. And a systems model, quite succinctly, says that there is many different factors that will have an impact on an outcome for, in this case, obesity. And what we want to try and do is understand the interaction of as many of these variables as possible. Last week, we looked at the physiological moderators, and the ones that we looked at were very much hormonal driven. We looked at the thyroid and the thyroid hormones through there. We looked at insulin, ghrelin, leptin. So we looked at a lot of the hormones that will have an impact. This week, I want to look at the final 5 factors that we're focusing on in Fantastic Fat Loss Physiology, and that being metabolic rate, metainflammation and C-reactive protein, and some other inflammatory markers. We're going to talk a bit about gut microbiota and leaky gut and how significant that is in the modern day obesity epidemic. We're going to talk about phthalates and endocrine disruptors, not just isolated phthalates there. We're going to talk about genetics and epigenetics and what impact that may potentially have in the future for us as well. Once we've reviewed those, we're then going to have a look at how the factor of weight change has an impact on its own systems model. We're then going to look at testing and treatment for these 10 variables, physiological variables there. And then we're going to go through a bit of a summary of the 3-part series. So topic 1, the influence of the physiological moderators on weight control. So this is the final 5 of these. The first of these is your metabolic rate. Now we know that we've got our metabolic rate, and there's a component of it is resting, and some of it is exercise, and the other part's thermogenesis. And depending on how much exercise you do will depend on how much is taken up by, or how much energy you burn in that quadrant or that quartile. But if we look at metabolic rate and its impact on obesity or its fluctuations in relation to obesity, we know that if we look at somebody's fat-free mass, so that's the muscle, the bone, the skin, and we add that to the fat mass, it explains approximately around 70% of the resting metabolic rate for an individual. But if we combine somebody's fat-free mass, the FFM, plus their fat mass, plus their organ-specific metabolic rates, then we can account for about 80% of an individual's resting metabolic rate. But we still can't account for the total individual's metabolic rate. So as we say here, they've found that there's about inter-individual variance that can be as high as around 300 kilocalories per day from one individual with the same body composition to another. So we talk about using formulas to determine someone's metabolic rate. What we've got to be aware of is that there is some variance and there may be some inaccuracies in these formulas. Also knowing that metabolic rate is significantly shunted around by things such as leptin. Now, leptin resistance, if we have leptin resistance, we know that that can have an impact on reverse T3, which is a thyroid hormone or protagonist hormone. And if reverse T3 is active, then it blocks the action of your thyroid hormones. So leptin resistance, which we spoke about last week, can have a negative impact. We also know that there can be an impact directly by your T3 hormones, and T3 being one of your thyroid hormones that will stimulate your metabolism, and that can be suppressed when we go through a weight loss process. And it's what we call adaptive thermogenesis. It's basically, as we lose weight, the body overcompensates. It actually decreases your metabolism further than what a physiological model would predict it should. Sympathetic nervous system activity, that can account for metabolic adaptation as well, and varied metabolic rates from one individual to the next. So metabolic rate, it can have an impact on an individual's drivers towards obesity. The next area is such an important area, and that is metaflammation and C-reactive protein, and more so focusing on the metaflammation. Basically, this table here by Dr. Gary Yeager, it shows a great relationship by many factors here that will have an impact directly on obesity and obesity into metaflammation. Now, the discussion is going at the moment is metaflammation. So what is it? If somebody has disease or they have an illness or a cut, they'll have inflammatory markers that will increase in their bloodstream, and they'll go by around, say, 400 to 500 units. Metaflammation is an inflammation that will occur in the bloodstream, but it doesn't go up by the 400 to 500 units. It only goes up by around 20 to 30 units. So the problem here is if a doctor was to try and measure for this, and measure using or looking for something such as C-reactive protein, they would discount it. They would say, well, it's not really high enough for it to be a concern. But what we are seeing is in modern metabolic disease and in the majority of obese people, not all, but the majority of obese people, there is metaflammation. There is this low-grade inflammation in the bloodstream that is associated with our modern metabolic diseases, and it has a strong association with obesity. Why is this significant? How is it identified? The one I've focused on here is C-reactive protein, and it's simply a marker that we can find in the bloodstream that will give us an indication of infection or inflammation. Now, more recently, CRP is linked with what we call TNF-alpha, another hormone there, and interleukin-6, which are cytokines or chemical signalers in the body. And they indicate that the person has a low-grade level of inflammation or metaflammation associated within their body. What impact does that have? Well, it can have an influence on our obesity hormones, such as insulin, ghrelin, and leptin. So being aware that this is present and trying to minimize the metaflammation that an individual has is so important. And that's what we hear about, low inflammatory foods. If we have a look at one of the significant portals into the human body, and that is topic number 3 here, which is your gut microbiome. Okay, now your gut microbiome is basically, or microbiome, gut microbiota, it's considered a metabolic organ, and it basically, the bacteria that live within our gut, they have a significant impact on our ability to digest things such as your foods, the catabolism of toxins and carcinogens in the body, synthesis of your micronutrients, your vitamins, your minerals. They also go through this bacteria in your gut, and it helps ferment the indigestible food substances that come into us there. With this gut microbiota, it is not part of our body, it coexists with our body. And it is an essential thing for helping our body run smoothly. Basically, the number of cells that we have in our body, or the number of cells that we have as bacteria that are in our body and coexist, they're not part of our body, they coexist, they outnumber our human cells by 10 to 1. By 10 to 1. This becomes extremely important. And another extremely important fact is the fact that they coexist. They're not part of our body, which means this gut microbiota have their own DNA. And we talk about epigenetics and the potential to change genetics in the body, but the potential to change the genetics and the DNA of these cells is another very significant factor. And we'll talk about this a little bit in topic number 5. So with the gut microbiota, it has been linked, or its ability to stay stable, and the 2 major ones there being your Firmicutes and Bacteroidetes. The ratio of those 2 becomes extremely important. Now, what what the gut microbiota will do, well, as we can see in point number 2, it has been linked with increased fat storage through lipogenesis, hepatic de novo synthesis of triglycerides, so the creation of triglycerides, along with altered lipid metabolism due to alteration of bile acid metabolites there. Basically, the type of diet we have can have a significant impact on what is happening with this gut microbiota through there. We know that there is certain inflammatory foods, and some inflammatory foods that we would look at there would be things such as your refined carbohydrates. You've got your refined carbohydrates, your alcohol being some of the more common ones that we would look at there. But there has also been an association with a high fat diet with an increase in the negative firmicutes, the fat bacteria. So we see our firmicutes over to the right-hand side here, and we see our Bacteroides, which are sitting down the bottom left here, which are the two primary gut microbiome that we're looking at as far as influencing what is happening within the body. And that is only with the technology that we have at the moment. So with respect to the gut microbiome, we also know that, if we come up top, that it's also been shown to be linked to chronic low-grade systemic metainflammation within the body there. So what can happen? This is the first point of entry of food into our body. And there is this metainflammation where they're looking and they're saying, is it because of the fat cells that we have metainflammation, which we know there is an impact of the fat cells on that because they're dying and the body attacks it and sees it as a foreign pathogen. But the first port at which food is coming through into the body is occurring through the gut lining. And if we upset and create an inflammatory gut lining, what happens is we have what we call leaky gut. Now, we've got our bacteria within the gut lining. If we take in foods that create this inflammation and we create a modified ratio between our two primary firmicutes and Bacteroides, then what can happen is we have what we call leaky gut. Leaky gut is where you've got normal tight junctions between the mucosal cells on our intestinal wall. Now, when we have inflammation occur, the intestinal walls, they don't hold that normal tight junction and they become leaky and inflamed. What this does, it allows particles, food particles, to get through that haven't been completely prepared to enter into the bloodstream. What this does is you have foreign bodies entering into the bloodstream. What does that do? The body then reacts and it wants to attack. And so it says, well, this is a foreign body, and it goes in to attack it. And this is part of what creates this low-grade metainflammation. Now, some call it inflammation, but we're looking at metainflammation is one of the more common terms used in relation to this. What we want to be able to do is we want to be able to make sure that our gut lining is working in the most effective way possible. The gut lining, the ability for foods to travel through here, it has been linked with things such as your immunity. If your gut lining isn't working properly, your immunity levels are low. The gut lining is linked with the brain as well. The gut-brain barrier, it is linked with everything. There is going to be so much more research going on in relation to the gut microbiome over the next years. It is going to start to tell us so much. I went to a conference in relation to gut microbiome about a year ago, and what they said is that we only have starting to find out what we don't know. So there is so much more that they really do and really will be finding out, and there's so many more papers coming up on this. I look forward in an upcoming summit that I have, interviewing some of the world leaders in relation to gut microbiome and the leaky gut syndrome there, and gaining a greater understanding of treatment protocols that are on the cutting edge of it there. Okay, so we've got our gut microbiome, which are extremely important, but what other things might lead to issues for us there? One of them here is high phthalate levels. Now, high phthalate levels can also have an impact on gut microbiome. My apologies. One thing that I didn't touch on there in relation to the gut microbiome was in the relationship of the variations in the bacteria that are associated there, and the DNA in relation to those. foods that we look at and we look at taking in, and they say, well, look, where should we start with respect to diet? And I won't do this with all topics because there's so many things, but with respect to your gut microbiome, you want to decrease things that are going to have a negative impact. So yes, your processed carbohydrates, we want to try and minimize. Be careful of the scaremongers with respect to carbohydrates, because we have people saying, oh, carbs are bad, but there's even some probiotics that are contained within grains. Now, you want to be taking in the good grains, such as your chia seeds through there. We want to be taking in the good grains, but there is some good probiotics that are contained within them. So just be cautious of those people who are saying decrease all your carbohydrates out. So what else can have an impact? Is it just food that can have an impact through there? Genetically modified food is something that we want to minimize. Genetically modified food, the reason we want to be careful of that is because genetically modified means that the DNA has been modified in that food. Now, if that food is then coming into contact with a bacteria that has the potential to change its DNA inside the intestinal walls here, then we still don't know what impact it's going to have. But as Dr. Raphael Kelman says, who wrote the Microbiome diet, he indicates that it's got to have some negative impact on it there. Other things that can have an impact is phthalates. These are what we call an endocrine disrupting chemical. Phthalates are basically used in the manufacturing of plastics, and what they do is they help keep the plastics together. Now, if we look at the bottles down the bottom here, so many people, they use a water bottle, and it might be one that they bought from the shops, and it might be one that's intended for only one use, but people tend to keep on filling those bottles up, and there's the potential for these phthalates, the chemicals in there, to leach into the water, and then we drink it, which means we're taking these endocrine, so hormonal disrupting chemicals into our body, which we want to try and minimize. You'll also see, and so with relation to phthalates in plastics, we want to try and minimize reusing bottles which aren't BPA free. We also want to avoid using containers that we're going to put into a microwave, because heat hitting any of these will actually increase the leaching of the phthalates into the foods. For me, I believe that your plastic wrap over the tops of your foods, you've got to be extremely cautious of as well, making sure if you put that into a microwave that it's not touching your foods. Otherwise, there's a high chance that these phthalates will be leaching into your food. Another example of phthalates coming into the body is the enteric coating of medications. This is also something that's going to contain phthalates. So it's going to be hormonal disrupting chemicals that are going to be leaching into our foods through there as well. Being conscious that your food preparation is correct, but being also conscious of the chemicals within the environment. Another example I use here with respect to endocrine disrupting chemicals is spraying on your deodorant. People spray on a deodorant or something similar, and these chemicals float into the air, and we just assume that it is going to be safe and it's not going to be dangerous for us. I believe that we have to be careful of anything that is not natural, that is going to be breathed or eaten or taken into our body, on it having an impact on our endocrine system, disrupting the chemicals through there, having an impact on our gastrointestinal tract and our gut microbiota through there. The final one here is gene variations. Now, you'll see that you've got the pictures of the mice there, the thin one and the fat one. And this is where the first thing we looked at was the internals of us, where we looked at things such as the Ob gene. Now, with respect to gene variations and them having an impact on human obesity, from what we know at the moment is things such as the Ob gene, which produces leptin deficiency, and if leptin levels are low, then hunger is high. The Ob gene presence is actually quite rare. It's not a significant one through there. So the focus on saying, this genetic mutation is one of the big problems that we've got is not a significant one there. But what they have found is that if we look at your DNA, what they call your methylation patterns, these may be used as genetic markers. And what they could do is some of these could actually help to predict weight loss. So there is some genes that if we can identify and locate these, they will indicate or give us an indication of variation or someone's potential to achieve weight loss. Another way that genetics could be used in the future with respect to weight loss, nutrition, diet, and food is that they've found that some people have different DNA that responds to the actual pleasure to different types of tastes in foods. So by finding out what food somebody actually truly enjoys, then you can actually prescribe that into their nutrition, which means they're going to actually enjoy the nutrition that you're recommending for them there, as opposed to just being a blanket, hey, everyone do this diet or everyone do this. It allows us to very much personalize the nutrition for the clients that we're seeing. The final part that has an impact on this dynamic systems model is the actual change in somebody's weight itself. When somebody's weight changes, it actually feeds backwards into the proximal drivers, but it also feeds upwards into the effectors and changes the impact that they are going to have. We have what we should consider normal responses after weight loss, and when someone's obese, what would be a normal response, and we have abnormal responses. So the example for a lot of people, when they're obese, cortisol levels are higher. After weight loss, it should lower. An abnormal response would be after weight loss if the cortisol level stayed normal. And this is what we talk about a dynamic systems model. We have all these variables across the board at the bottom here: cortisol, ghrelin, leptin, insulin, metabolic rate, metainflammation, leaky gut. We can include your thyroid hormones and how they're going to react as well. They have what should happen as a normal response, but not everyone is the same. Not everyone's DNA is the same, and everybody's going to respond a little bit differently there. When I become obese, my ghrelin levels would be lower then if I'm eating in a normal state through there. After weight loss, my ghrelin levels may increase, and an abnormal response would be if when I put on weight, my ghrelin levels were high. Leptin, when I'm obese, the levels should be high, and an abnormal response would be if I was obese and the leptin levels were low. After weight loss, leptin should decrease, and that then stimulates appetite. Insulin, we can see same thing. When we're obese, insulin levels for most people when they're obese are quite high. Insulin resistance, leptin resistance. Insulin resistance. So abnormal response would be after weight loss if my insulin levels still stayed high. After weight loss, they should drop down. Metabolic rate, bigger person, higher metabolic rate. If their metabolic rate was blunted when they were obese, that would be a significant issue. But when they lose weight, metabolic rate should decrease. But what do we know? Adaptive thermogenesis means that a lot of people, when they lose weight, their metabolic rate drops even lower. And that can cause us problems by misprediction. Obesity with metainflammation. There is a strong link between metainflammation and obesity. When we lose weight, metainflammation, or that low level inflammation in the bloodstream, should decrease. If that stays high, once again, a significant problem and review of diet. And leaky gut. For people who are obese, there is a high incidence of leaky gut. When I lose weight, it should start to decrease, but it takes time. It takes time to achieve the response, and an abnormal response would be if leaky gut did not reverse at all. So the actual process of losing weight feeds back into all these variables and will impact their impact upon the person's obesity systems model. I realize quite confusing, and hopefully I've kept it reasonably succinct and understandable there. Testing and treatment of the physiological variables here. Now, with respect to these, we'll look at the testing processes through there. There are so many variables, and to try and be an authority on all of these is beyond the scope of this webinar, and it's beyond the scope of one individual, because people study these ones individually their whole life. And this becomes an important factor. A lot of people study them individually, but they don't blend them together sufficiently and often enough. So testing and treatment for weight loss, what can we do? Well, we could look at doing blood tests with our clients. Okay, what would they be used to determine endocrine abnormalities? And things that we could look at there are things such as cortisol levels, ghrelin levels, leptin levels, insulin levels, thyroxine and reverse T3 tests, C-reactive protein. All of these are potentially tested. And what we're going to look at the end is the focus ones, the ones which appear to have the ability to be treatable through intervention. But these are the ones, I'm just stating, these are the ones that can be looked at and tested. Now, blood tests are intrusive. There is also a significant shift towards saliva testing. It's receiving a much greater focus, and they're finding a broader application for it in the market. The issue that they have is similar to stool testing, where it's the stability of the samples and how do they store it and transport it and keep the actual content of it stable. But things that it can look for here are things such as C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor. Now, with these three that tell us about an individual's degree of metaflammation in their system there. They've also identified that there's cortisol markers that can be found in saliva, insulin markers, which are positive ones, and one that we haven't talked about, or positive to identify. One we haven't talked about throughout the process of this is a marker called adiponectin, or a chemical signal called adiponectin. Adiponectin is a positive hormone within the human body, and if this level is low, then we are much more prone to things such as metaflammation and modern metabolic diseases. So having a high level of adiponectin becomes a positive one for us there. Saliva having potential to be a marker for it. So say, for example, we had increased cortisol levels. We know that this is indicative of stress. So would we just do one test to identify it? No, because it tells us, okay, there might be stress, but what we'd want to do, and this becomes a very simplistic application of a systems model, but we'd combine this with a behavioral questionnaire to identify, well, what is happening in this person's life that is resulting in increased cortisol levels? You've got your ghrelin, your leptin, and insulin. These are the three most studied adiposity and appetite hormones. And they've looked at administration of leptin or blocking of ghrelin, and they said it shows promise, but there's still no viable solution that's available. One of the things that we know is that if you block one of these, the body is very adaptable in creating new pathways to stimulate appetite. It's very protective of not dying of starvation. And as we mentioned that in part 1 of the series, the body is very well adapted at not allowing us to lose weight. Abnormal insulin levels, they're the most common of the adiposity hormones, but what would we do? Well, we'd look at dietary and activity interventions along with education would be required with respect to this. So it's not just, do we do the blood test? But no, we'd have a look at dietary and activity interventions, and we would have done questionnaires, as we'll look at in a short while in relation to this. There may be some pharmaceutical intervention that may be required for a person who has abnormal insulin or is type 2 diabetic, or if worse, they're type 1 diabetic. Increased C-reactive protein levels. These indicate low-grade systemic inflammation. So that's linked to obesity and modern metabolic disease. So once again, diet and some sort of supplementation recommendations that would help minimize inflammation or metaflammation in the body could be considered. We also might look at fecal and urinary testing. Fecal testing, this would be used to establish gut microbiota levels there, which we know are associated with metaflammation and possible neuroendocrine abnormalities, immunity, immune response through there, and also we talked about the gut-brain barrier also. So fecal testing is an option there for your gut microbiota. Urine testing. This would be used to identify endocrine disrupting chemicals such as phthalate. So urine testing can be used through there. What a systems model would do is combine this information from these tests with lifestyle questions relating to medications or food preparation or plastics that they use in their daily life there. We know that high phthalate levels, they're associated with obesity, and they are an endocrine disrupting or hormonal disrupting chemicals. One which I am extremely big proponent of is gas analysis. If somebody wants to go into an obesity and weight loss approach, gas analysis is the best way for us to determine an individual's metabolic rate. We talk about having 300 kilocalorie variation outside of what the mathematical formulas will say. What gas analysis allows us to do, it allows us to measure how much energy someone's burning. It allows us to work out whether they're burning more fats or carbohydrates there. It'll then allow us to then look at and combine this information with, well, what are their blood profiles saying through there? is there an insulin resistance? What are they burning? Are they burning all carbs? Are they burning fats? And then as somebody loses weight, it allows us also to measure their metabolic rate and seeing if there is this metabolic adaptation that's occurring there, adaptive thermogenesis. So not very commonplace in the market, but I believe it can make up a critical component of the area of knowledge that we really do need to be effective in weight loss. The next one here is your body weight and composition. What do we do through here? Now, for mine, DEXA scanning being the ultimate tool here. That's the dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, and it become a lot more mainstream now with respect to cheaper machines which are more accessible to the majority of the population there. DEXA, we know what it does. It scans the body, and it can break the body into cubic millimeters of muscle, fat, organs. So it is a very accurate way. It is the most accurate way of determining an individual's body composition. Body weight, you've got your Tanita scales and things such as that. They give us some good information as well. Some people say not to take body weight, not to do body composition or measures and stuff like that. And what they've shown through the study in the with respect to the National Weight Control Registry, which I mentioned in part 1 of the series. So if you look up National Weight Control Registry online and Google it, you'll see that one of the things that they've found is there is a direct correlation on maintenance of weight loss over a 12-month period after these people have lost 13 kilograms or more. The people that weigh themselves more frequently, they keep the weight off, more weight off, and they keep it off for longer. So people can say, hey, look, don't weigh yourself, but the research shows that body weight measuring, it is very effective at helping someone keep their weight off. We've then got lifestyle questionnaires, and these are going to start to give us some more information that are going to help back up some of the blood tests that we looked at there. And the lifestyle questionnaires, they can assess general factors of lifestyle that might impact an individual's obesogenic environment. So the activity, how much activity are they doing, how much sleep, what sort of occupation, drugs and alcohol that they may be taking. I mean, example, if someone is hypertensive, which we know obesity can lead to that, and they're taking beta blockers, well, beta blockers, they can suppress someone's metabolic rate. So being aware as to the things that they're taking that might have an impact. Technology-induced pathology there, people sitting and watching screens all the time, understanding what's happening in their world, and being empathetic as a result, not telling someone to just completely change it, but understanding the crux of the problem. It mightn't be food, it might be that they've got an inactive lifestyle. These scores or answers, they can be entered into the systems model. We can take these into account. The treatment for these after the lifestyle questionnaires, well, the treatment, it could be behavioral counseling. It could be psychological or psychiatric treatment, fitness or movement coaching and education. There's a whole myriad of different approaches that we can take to have an impact on this person's obesogenic environment. You've then got your dietary questionnaires, so obviously different to your lifestyle questionnaires, which start to give us an indication or an insight into what are the foods that they're taking in. This may start to help explain some of the metainflammation that's occurring with the individual's body at the moment. So quite self-explanatory, but all of these different style questionnaires have an impact. So the lifestyle questionnaires, so not so much the lifestyle, but more behavioral questionnaires. These be used for assessing an individual's psychological state, things such as meaninglessness. Okay, what is my purpose? What am I doing in life? Alienation from society, lack of cultural identity, which can happen in different cultures. If they've migrated into a country, if they're quite often there's been people have migrated or countries have been taken over and people have then been pushed out of their traditional cultural identity, and they have this feelingless, which relates back up to the meaninglessness. What am I? What is my cultural identity? Relationships are significant with respect to stress and cortisol through there. So relationships, is that an issue or a stressor? And stress generally, and that could be through work, etc. Once again, the treatment of these might be counseling, psychological, psychiatric treatment, or less intense treatment, such as education on relaxation or stress management techniques. Behavioral care questionnaires, they can be combined with a blood test, like for cortisol, to determine effectiveness in during a retest. So I test someone's cortisol levels, I do the relaxation, stress reduction, and see whether there's a decrease in the cortisol levels. So if we look at a bit of a summary of the fantastic fat loss physiology and discuss, well, what are the applications? Basically, the intent of my thesis was to really look at what can we do with respect to a systems model. And hopefully over the last 3 series, you've been able to see that there is so much more to obesity and obesity management than simply energy in, energy out. That it goes well beyond a linear physics approach to it there. We've got to consider and different tools that we might use: the behavioral, lifestyle, and dietary questionnaires, blood tests, genetic testing, saliva tests, gas analysis, fecal and urinary testing, body weight, body fat. All these things can be tested and combined into a systems model to determine what is the most effective treatment protocol. You know, another example, a dietary questionnaire might be combined with a behavioral questionnaire and blood tests or saliva tests for the HOMA-IR, insulin resistance test, to determine the optimal treatment protocol. You know, the treatment, the protocols will include dietary and activity recommendations. The systems model might determine if counseling, behavioral, or lifestyle recommendations are required. Psychiatric, relaxation, pharmaceutical. There's so many different avenues we've got in the process of treating obesity. I believe that these are the major focus areas. If someone is truly, from a physiological perspective, looking towards testing with respect to obesity, areas to focus on would be DEXA. I believe the DEXA, the dual energy X-ray absorbiometry, will tell us a lot about an individual's body composition, and any changes that occur in that body composition are significant, and we really, really do want to be able to understand these, whether they're going up or coming back down. You've then got the metabolic testing. Now, metabolic testing is the gas analysis, which allows us to understand what somebody's metabolic rate is. So as there's a change in the individual's body composition, we can do further metabolic testing to identify what is happening. Are they going through adaptive thermogenesis? Has there been a dropping of their metabolic rate? Do we then focus a little bit more on weight training, and do we increase frequency of eating to try and have an impact upon metabolism? It helps us develop this complete protocol. Areas to focus on with challenging weight loss clients, you might think, if I do put one more in areas to focus on, and I missed this in the testing component, and that is if you don't have things like DEXA, metabolic testing, simply doing someone's waist measurement is an extremely, extremely useful tool. If for a female, her waist is greater than 88 centimeters, and for a male, their waist is greater than 102 centimeters, it indicates a significantly increased risk of them suffering from the modern metabolic diseases. So if you don't have access to any of these others, simply doing a waist measure is a fantastic place for you to start in determining your client's risk and whether you maybe should send them to the doctor and get some blood tests done. Areas to focus on with challenging weight loss clients, I believe the gut microbiota is the starting point and should be the starting point for every single client that we have. Gut microbiome and leaky gut, understanding this is extremely important, and it comes even before thyroid, which a lot of people focus on, because as discussed in part 2 of the series, the gut microbiota has an impact on the thyroid. It can have an impact on insulin. It has an impact on CRP or metaflammation. If we get the gut microbiota right, a lot of people say all these other things will fix themselves up very quickly. What's coming up? Now, this task of doing this 3-part series, I found personally quite daunting, even though it was my master's thesis. Why? Because there is so many areas, and I'd love to think that I knew everything in all of these, but you look at one of these areas and you realize how much there is to know. My goal here throughout the process of this series was to really say, hey, what we need to do is we need to look broader and see how all these things combine back in together. What I've got coming up, and we're looking at November, the summit is going to go live, is a Fitness Professionals Global Summit, and it is the weight loss edition. I have been able to get access to some of the world's leading experts who would be able to allow you to educate you and allow you to speak with authority and confidence on things such as the impact of hormones, gut health, gut microbiota, metabolism, and one which we haven't touched on in any big degree here because it's more physiology, but it is the psychology of weight loss. And we can relate that back into gut health as well, but the impact of all of these on an individual's ability to achieve outcomes. I'm so excited about this summit. I really hope you can join me on the summit through there. And if you are interested, please remember gavin@gavinaquilina.com to get my contact information. I'd like to thank you so much for joining me. If you join me just for this part of the series, thank you. If you would like to see more of the series, please let me know. If you do have any questions, please gavin@gavinaquilina.com. Please share your friends with your friends the series and have them come on board, or at a minimum have them email me and I will actually send out the links and get them lined up to participate in the program. Once again, thank you all very much, and I look forward to joining you for the World Weight Loss, or for the Fitness Professionals Global Summit. Thank you.